there's a lot of talk today about the Republican Party needs to reach out to the Hispanic vote. And I think that is really not a very good idea. What the Republican Party needs to do is to reach out to the middle class.
Ed, the court went wrong in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. And then 2 years later, as you've argued, the court went wrong again on this question of birthright citizenship. This was in the Wong Kim Ark case. Is that coincidence, or is there some connection between the way the court reasoned in those two cases?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I've never really looked for a connection between the two cases. But I think there's no doubt that the Plessy versus Ferguson case was wrong as a matter of constitutional law when it was decided. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's possible to say that it was right for the times and then...
Although some people say that.
I think it's the usual way to say that it was right for the times, and then the constitutional jurisprudence evolved after that. It was wrong at the time it was decided, and I think that Justice Harlan in dissent was right. Justice Harlan did not say that society was colorblind. That would have been a silly thing to say because it was obvious that society was not colorblind, but the Constitution was in fact colorblind. And he said if we stick to our principles, that is to say that the law, the Constitution cannot take into account racial classifications, I think that we would have been much better off had that opinion prevailed. And I think we would have been much better off had the court in Wong Kim Ark stuck to the Constitution as well. There's no possible reason or possible argument that I can think of that anybody in 1898 could have said that the 14th Amendment adopted the British common law of birthright citizenship. Anybody who's read the Declaration of Independence, and it says that we have dissolved our allegiance to the King of England. I mean, that is the great violation of the common law right there. It's impossible to dissolve your allegiance to the King of Great Britain. That's revolutionary doctrine, to say the least. And so how do you account for the Declaration of Independence? I think the court just simply wasn't thinking in that regard.
Right. It wouldn't mean, of course, that you could leave scot-free even under the birthright citizenship and expatriation, or under the expatriation standard, right? Because if you owe debts, if you have been convicted of a crime,
right,
you can't just leave whenever you want to leave, whenever it's convenient for you to leave, even under the Declaration of Independence.
Of course not. No.
Theory.
Yeah. Once you've you consented to be governed, of course you acquire obligations, and once you've acquired the obligations, you have to fulfill the obligations. And if you want to leave or to expatriate yourself to escape obligations, of course we have no obligation ourselves to let you go. But once you've fulfilled your obligations and you want to leave, if you think you can do better in some other country and the other country will accept you, then we have the obligation to let you go and with all of your property.
And so that of course is a key proviso. The other country has to admit you.
Of course.
It has the right to admit you or not admit you. And so that brings us to something like the current situation where there are many millions of illegal aliens in the United States, or undocumented Democrats, as Jay Leno likes to call them.
That's not bad. I hadn't heard that.
and they're here, and regardless of whether there's an amnesty or what happens to them, their children, every generation, are American citizens. And that's the anomaly, the policy, public policy anomaly that you're putting your finger on and that you're interested in. But now, as a practical matter, what would you recommend that we do about it? I mean, since we're debating amnestying or otherwise legalizing people who are here illegally, now we're talking about people who are here legally, at least under current law. Is there any practical advantage to be had from trying to reverse birthright citizenship in the way that you have suggested?
Well, I think that there would be practical advantages. I must say that I'm not against immigration. I think we have plenty of room for a lot of people to come to the country. But I think that we ought to be the ones selecting the people to come to the country. They ought not to be self-selected, as illegal immigrants are self-selected coming to the country and then demanding citizenship. This provokes some very profound questions about how sovereign are we as a nation if we can't determine who comes to the country. We can't treat citizens differently than non-citizens and so on and so forth. So I think the problem is illegal immigration. Now, a lot of people say we depend upon the illegal immigrants, that they do the work that Americans won't do. I'm not so sure that that's true, given our economic situation today. But I think it's a bad idea to have illegal immigration. There are always going to be demands for amnesty. There's always going to be demands for citizenship. And if we have no control, then of course we're really quite literally no longer a sovereign nation. We ought to have control over our borders. We ought to be able to determine who we allow in, and the people we allow ought to be those who can contribute most to our prosperity and should serve the interests of the United States. And that ought to be the basis of our public policy.
Let me ask you about the other side of the problem. How well are we succeeding at assimilating immigrants, legal or illegal, to the United States? I mean, Teddy Roosevelt 100 years ago talked about Americanization as the fate of the immigrant and the fate to be desired by immigrants and non-immigrants alike. Can we still talk about that?
Well, I think progressives of all stripes are saying that the old idea of the melting pot is a disguised form of racism, that we ought not to try to ask people to assimilate, that assimilation is a kind of hegemony that really is, what do they call it, sort of, wanting to stamp out the cultural diversity that people bring with them, and that we ought to celebrate the cultural diversity. We ought not to make people speak the same language that we do, or to adhere to cultural traditions that are unique.
It is. Well, it is a tough bargain. I mean,
it is very tough.
It isn't easy.
No. It isn't easy.
Assimilate.
Yeah, but of course we have to have a sort of an agreement that we all share the same principles. Do you know when Abraham Lincoln, in one of his famous speeches, talked about the electric cord that draws everybody back to the principles of the Declaration of Independence? We are not all of the same blood, he said, but that old Declaration of Independence gives us something in common, because we share those principles, and that's what makes us one people. But we've lost that a long time ago. And if we can't revive those sentiments, but everything that we experience today, I mean, everything in the university, militates against that. I'm not sure that we can recover that old idea, because we are told over and over again that there's a kind of genocide behind the melting pot. There's a kind of hidden genocide behind trying to make people assimilate to things that are foreign to them. And we ought not to make them give those things up, but we should celebrate those things.
Do you think multiculturalism is a coherent concept?
Well, not to my mind, it's not coherent. I mean, we've seen places in the world that have celebrated multiculturalism, and they've degenerated into a kind of anarchy in some respects. Look, I think that constitutional government has only been successful in a nation state. I don't know. I'm always hearkening back to one of President George W. Bush's famous statements about immigration. We ought to show compassion to our neighbors to the south. Or he said famously on several occasions that family values don't stop at the border. And I think that that's true. I mean, we always have compassion for people who want to provide a better life for themselves and for their families. And family values, presumably, are universal values. They don't stop at the border. But that statement of President Bush's is suitable for the world homogeneous state, in which citizenship is not really a factor. But the world homogeneous state is not going to be a constitutional government in which citizens have unique privileges and immunities and unique liberties. And I think that the system of nation states, as long as it is the preserve of constitutional government, which I am sure that it is going to require citizenship and unique privileges and immunities that belong to citizenship. Now, I think that illegal immigration, undermines and debases that idea of citizenship. But look, we have interests in the United States that depend upon illegal immigration. I've said this many, many times. There are only two groups of people in the United States who want to continue illegal immigration, and that's the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans, mainly because they want cheap and exploitable labor, and the Democrats because they want future voters. And there is no real incentive to stop or to control the border. Democrats are always going to have an interest in future voters, and Republicans, and the Democrats too, I don't mean to say this is exclusively Republican, always want a steady supply of cheap and exploitable labor. And so there's little incentive. I can remember I was working in Washington in 1986 and had a very, very minor role in consulting on the Immigration and Control Act of 1986. And people were so confident this will be the final thing that we're going to do. This will solve the immigration problem. And I can remember saying, you people are naive if you believe that there's going to be border control. There will be no border control because nobody is interested in border control. And that was the truth.
Stanley Kurtz said the other day that what we have in the United States today is a acculturation, but not assimilation. That is, young people who are illegal, or even older people who are illegal immigrants in the United States, gradually do adjust to American culture. I mean, they begin to watch American television, and they listen to American radio and so forth. And of course, they use the internet, but they don't patriotically assimilate. Now, what can be done about that? I mean, you've given a pretty grim indictment of higher education and every other level of education.
Yeah,
Is there nothing that can be done to bring back some idea of patriotic assimilation?
I think so. Well, we're university people, so we know what it's like in the university. There's no attempt at acculturation, but there's an attempt to keep the groups separate and as much as possible, racial pride, ethnic pride, all of the rest of this business. And I don't think there's no future for the country in that kind of talk. There's a lot of talk today about the Republican Party needs to reach out to the Hispanic vote. And I think that is really not a very good idea. What the Republican Party needs to do is to reach out to the middle class. And the progressives have waged open warfare against the middle class for a number of years. And this is very evident in the Obama administration. This is what the administrative state, the welfare state, needs to do, is to destroy the middle class, make more and more people clients of the welfare state, to expand the administrative state, to increase its reach, and so on and so forth. Now, at one time, I think that the fastest growing, as we say, the fastest growing demographic in the country was the middle class. And that was multi-ethnic and multiracial. And a concentration on the middle class was, of course, the future for the Republican Party. And there's where it ought to be again. And that's the greatest method of acculturalization. I say move people into the middle class. Give them opportunities to get into the middle class, not appeal to them.
Then they can send their children to college.
Yeah, well, there's a problem. Send them to college and they can start the multi-ethnic push all over again. Now you're being a little bit pessimistic. But I think this idea of keeping the races separate, the administrative state is good at that.
Counting by race.
Counting by race.
Right.
And when we had the Immigration Act of 1965, as part of one of the three great acts of the Great Society, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I happen to believe was a perfect expression of what the framers of the 14th Amendment meant by equal protection of the laws. Nobody could be made to bear the burden of a racial classification in hiring and firing and promotion and so on.
But you wouldn't go back to the pre-1965 immigration law necessarily,
no,
would you?
Of course
do
not.
National origins quotas?
No, of course not. But and as I was saying about the 64 Act, perfectly, no individual can be made to bear the burden of a racial class. But that law was transmogrified into a law that required racial classifications and so on and so forth. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, another piece of Great Society legislation, perfectly good on its face. No discrimination in voting and running for office, no racial classifications. Became the tool of racial classifications. We need racial proportionality in voting and in voting results and so on. Well, the 65 Immigration Act was a kind of affirmative action program too, because we want to make up for racial policies that drove previous immigration policies. But I think that the 65 Act was a little bit more insidious. We want to bring in people from parts of the world who are most unlike us. And who are going to find it much more difficult to assimilate into an American way of life than people who came here previously. And sooner or later, the middle class will be overwhelmed by these people who are going to need the ministrations of the administrative state. And I think that this was on the part of people who could really see the intent, the real intent of this act.
But in terms of contemporary immigration policy, your pitch would be for skills-based admissions of some
I think
kind?
that we need skill-based admissions. Bring in people who who don't need the welfare state, who perhaps even have demonstrated that they speak English or at least are learning English, who can move into skilled jobs, who are poised to move into the middle class and move up the economic ladder, and who are not going to depend upon the welfare state. Expand the middle class and make the middle class a multi-ethnic and a multiracial middle class, and that's the key to our future.